Yes. Yep.
Okie dokie. Yes, hello from New Zealand. The sun's just risen and it's winter. It's 8 degrees, and you can work out what that is in Fahrenheit. This talk is I'm not going to actually answer a lot of questions. It's going to actually raise questions. So I'm going to be talking about composite seasonal adjustment, define it, talk about what Stats New Zealand's approach is to it, and some puzzles that I've had since we've been doing it. So composite seasonal adjustment, most of you should be aware, and also Tucker and Kathy talked about it in their session at the beginning. It's basically was motivated by a lovely talk by Brian the other day, Brian Monsell, about the R package seasonal can now handle composite series, which makes it a lot easier. So composite simply is just a total that's an arithmetic combination of some components, and I'm going to keep it simple. So I'm going to say C is equal to A plus B. Is seasonally adjusted C equal to seasonally adjusted A plus seasonally adjusted B, or is seasonally adjusted C equal to seasonally adjusted A plus B? So the first one's indirect, the second one's direct. Direct adjustment does not preserve additivity, so the preference is obviously for indirect. Now, I'll just do a little bit of a theory here. If it's additive adjustments, you can see that the way that the components, so I've broken A out into its 3 components, B into its 3 components, so you can sort of see they combine quite nicely. I stress that you're actually estimating all of these components, so it doesn't necessarily mean that SA plus SB is going to equal if you do it separately. Multiplicative components are more complicated, so I won't go into it, but I have a document that covers it, and it sort of explains. So the practice, if the seasonal factors combine nicely, it is a case of what is the signal to noise ratio for indirect versus direct. So you're estimating the components, and it comes down to which way. You can sort of do a hand wavy thing, you can show formula, but the easiest way to hand wavy thing is if the components are in phase. In other words, they got a pretty similar seasonal patterns. The direct adjustment is likely to be better because as you add them up, the seasonal components reinforce, whereas the irregulars sort of cancel each other. So your signal gets increased and your noise stays about the same. If the series are out of phase, it's probably better to indirectly adjust because the seasonal pattern starts sort of cancelling it out and your irregular stays about the same. So your signal to noise ratio goes. And I just remind, all we can do is estimate components. So Statistics New Zealand, we have about 1,200 employees. New Zealand has a population smaller than Maryland, just to give you some idea of where we are. And we produce everything from GDP, CPI, agricultural statistics, household labour force statistics, you name it. So as you can imagine, we're pretty basic here. We introduced composite adjustments into 1980s when we migrated from SAS Proc X11 to Stats Canada's X11 ARIMA software. And I always like to look back because I was involved in the introduction in that in the mid-80s, that I just needed 2 sign-offs to get it done. Those were the days. And the policy for, we found that there was composite in this X11 ARIMA from Stats Canada, so we decided we'd do the composite. And we just used the X11 ARIMA composite quality statistics to choose it. So we didn't actually have a preference. We had a slight preference for indirect, but we would sort of take it direct if the quality statistics. For those of you who don't know, I'm not going to go into much detail, but the quality was based on that smoothness criteria, the R1s and the R2s. Those are the formulas there if you want. We programmed into our seasonal adjustment system the ability to graph the direct and the indirect seasonally adjusted series on top of each other. It doesn't seem to be done a lot, and I think it's really quite good because the thing is, I say to people, is that the direct versus indirect, it's not the decision of which one to choose. It's useful to compare both of them, particularly if in recent time, and I'll be coming into this a little bit later, you get different stories because then that means something odd might be happening. So that's always a good thing. So there are various things that we had to work out, how to work from the bottom to the top. So if A plus B equals C and D plus D equals F and C plus F equals G, remember we haven't made a decision to do direct or indirect as a policy. So we could have things where we're doing things at different levels and intermediate levels. So we had a process for that. how to handle non-seasonal components. That was the thing. Now, a thing you've got to realize is Statistics New Zealand, we publish trends. And one of the things we found is when we first started using it, we had this indirect trend, and we just thought at some stage, I wonder what where this comes from. How is it calculated? Well, actually, nobody could tell us. So we actually pulled out the Fortran code and the modules, and we actually found what it's done. So if anybody wants to know, unless it's changed, because this was about 30 years ago that we found this out. And in the time that I've been working on this, which will be 30 something years, I've got various publishing, puzzling output and problems, and I'm just going to work my way through them, a cook's tour, so to speak. And if anybody wants to talk to me about them, I'd be more than pleased, particularly if they've got ideas of that it's not actually puzzling, it's what you should expect. I can have the theory or whatever. So puzzle number one, model consistency. Now, there's a lot of work in the econometrics thing about model consistency of aggregate series. They call it aggregate series rather than composite. Say your Riemann models for your components compared to your Riemann models for your total. Now, one of the weird things that I'm a bit puzzled over is you have a composite which is a balance. So it's a trade balance or something like that. So you've got C equals A minus B. Now, the balances have negative values, so we have to use additive adjustment, and they look additive too. But the components are clearly multiplicative. So we're applying a multiplicative seasonal adjustment model to A and B, and yet we're applying an additive seasonal adjustment model to C. It's a puzzle, so that's why I'm saying, should we worry? Puzzle 1A is, if we're going to do Riemann models as well, how do we do them? Because we could have quite different Riemann models in the components as we do in the totals. And I'm going to sort of come back to that as well. For us, because we do trends, the indirect trend should be, remember I said we had to work out where the indirect trend comes from. We just released the stuff directly out of X13 ARIMA, which is either the D12 or the ITN. That's the indirect one. Now, in two cases for indirect outputs that I know of, they loaded their seasonal adjustment components and actually created the sums themselves internally inside their time series database. And they did the same for the trends. So they just added the component D12s. So when they said they were doing this, I thought, oh, well, this is going to cause a problem because you've got all of these, say maybe 10 D12s, all sort of going all over the place. And so I would thought adding up the D12s, you get a less smooth, but in both cases I was wrong. When they added the D12s, they got a smoother series than, so go figure, it's a puzzle. There's a case of the fishing industry. The components are highly seasonal, those some small values, which Tucker did some work for me some years ago. However, the total is not. So obviously it's probably fishing boats go out and catch whatever is in season, so to speak. So should we even bother with the composite? Puzzle number 4 is that there's more than one way to create a composite. So let's say you've got it's like a two-way table. You've got the cells, you add the cells up to the marginal totals on the side and the marginal totals on the bottom, and then you add those marginal totals to the total in the corner. Well, you're going to struggle a bit. The only way you can really do that is just to force everything to be indirect, because then everything adds up. But you could end up with residual seasonality, which Tucker talked about this morning. So can't do it both ways. So do we pick the most important way? A plus B may be the regions, and D plus E may be industries. One may be more important for indirect. Or just pick the composite with the best quality. So that's puzzle 4. Puzzle number 5 is you get outliers in different places in the components. We can identify the outliers in the components, but it's unlikely to be aligned with the ones in the composite, because remember, it's an outlier in a component, and then once you add the other components, it doesn't. So generally we find it's not a problem, but we've had problems with largish outliers in one or two components not being recognized in the direct composite. So again, it comes back to my thing, are we comparing like with like? Particularly if you're coming back to that point about Riemann. Puzzle number 6, this happened to me at least once. There's a difference between the component story and the composite story. For a composite series with two components, we had that the direct gave the better adjustment. 1 month, both of the components went down, but the composite went up. And needless to say, the client was a bit worried. We never got to the bottom of it as the anomaly disappeared the next month, and it didn't actually sort of go down or up. It sort of flatlined a bit. There's some possibilities of human error, technical glitch, or it could be methodologically interesting, which is always lots of fun. And the perennial is, how do we decide which is the best seasonal adjustment? And also in Stats New Zealand's case, what is the best trend? You can sort of go through and say, oh, neither have got residual seasonality. But in terms of the best explanation, and that's me. If you want to talk composites, there's my email. Email me, and I'll happy to discuss this at any time.
Thank you, Richard. I love talks where there's puzzles we get to solve.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay, next up,